Yeah, don't worry.
Hi, bienvenidos. Hola, welcome to Community Talk. Bienvenidos a Hablando de Comunidad. Mi nombre es Connie Guerrero y aquí estoy con Rudy Espinosa. Rudy, how are you? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Connie. Qué gusto verte. I love seeing you.
Igualmente, ¿cómo has estado? ¿Cómo pasaste el año nuevo?
Bien, bien. Ahorita estoy en Miami, Florida. Estoy con mi familia, así que feliz, ¿no? Que puedo pasar el año nuevo con mi familia cercana, ¿no? Después de estar en California por tanto tiempo.
Muy bien, Rudy. Welcome. Well, today we have a very special show and a very special guest, right, that we're going to be talking to today. Someone that's a dear friend of mine and one of my favorite persons here in San Mateo County. Right, Rudy?
That's right. And I want to talk a little bit about him before we bring him onto the show. So this is someone who's spent many, many years, a bit over 2 decades, working in politics and government, even having served with President Clinton back in the late 90s, and now runs his own public affairs consulting company, working in community outreach, government affairs, media and public relations, and also working with different campaigns. So we're very excited to bring Don Cecil.
Welcome, Don.
Feliz año nuevo a ustedes.
Hola, Don. ¿Cómo estás?
Estoy bien, gracias.
Muy bien.
I feel muy viejo when Rudy talks about the Clinton administration.
I know. I was like, should I mention that? Because get mad at me.
No.
Well, welcome, Don, to Community Talk.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Happy to have you here. I mean, you just are amazing. You have a lot of years of working on, throughout the Bay Area and a whole bunch of different campaigns and people in the Bay Area. And I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us here. We want to reach out to the community and the Latino community, and we're really trying to raise the voice of the Latino community. So I really appreciate you being here, and we're just gonna have a little conversation about your thoughts maybe on
Great.
Your thoughts and maybe what you think about this reflections of the past election.
Yes, absolutely. But where do you want to start? Do you want to start in Redwood City? Do you want to keep it at a San Mateo County level?
Sure, we can talk local.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think what was very unique and special about this election cycle, notwithstanding, we were in the middle of a global pandemic, and we were in the midst of a much needed reckoning on social justice, on racism, on lots of very important issues. But it was also a much deeper and broader rollout of district elections. So you had elections at a district level in Menlo Park, Redwood City, also in South San Francisco and in other communities. And so starting with Redwood City, because I know that's near and dear to the three of us in terms of where we live or where we have a lot of history, it was the first rollout of that model in the city of Redwood City. And I think it accomplished on so many levels what it set out to do. And that doesn't mean everyone's happy with it, which is a good thing. But we saw the re-election of Alicia Aguirre, which in looking at that race, I have a lot of takeaways from that. So when I read John May's editorial endorsement of Alicia, he gets her. He understands her. He understands that quiet, humble leadership that she brings to almost everything she does. And the three of us knowing her like we do, we also know, she was trying to be a college professor on Zoom every day. And the challenges of leading and teaching were something that I marveled at her ability, and every teacher in their ability to do. Also, when I look at Alicia's win, it was a decisive win. There was nothing that she didn't limp over the finish line in any way in that election. She had two other candidates, each who was committed on whatever level they were able to execute at in trying to be successful and win. And Alicia could have been seen as someone with a lot of vote history about growth and development and taller buildings than people might think are appropriate in downtown Redwood City. And she won. The other thing that I really find fascinating about the citywide election in Redwood City is the Caltrain measure. So that was Measure RR, and that was an 1/8 of a cent sales tax increase to provide dedicated funding to Caltrain. That won handily up and down San Mateo County, and especially in Redwood City. I think there wasn't a precinct, maybe a handful, that was below 70-75% approval. And when I looked at the results in the precincts around Sequoia Station and the Redwood City Caltrain station, you had sometimes over 80% of voters approving that. And so my takeaway on that is we're actually happy with downtown Redwood City. And we believe in this concept of clustering growth and development around a Caltrain station. And Alicia being elected so solidly and being one who has voted on almost all of those projects, I think Redwood City is happy with itself. And I think when you move that election from an odd year with a low voter turnout to an even year with a higher voter turnout, more happy people showed up and said, yeah, we like this, and we like the direction that these leaders are taking us. You had Jeff G., which, for some people may have felt like a re-election, but Jeff was solidly re-elected in the Redwood Shores district. Michael Smith was solidly elected. No one should think that Michael doesn't deserve to take the same credit as all four other candidates in the Redwood City City Council race simply because he ran unopposed. Michael's been a dedicated community leader, served passionately on the Planning Commission, and that is a victory for him. And then, I think that the example of the power of district elections is certainly with Councilmember Espinoza Garnica. So district elections was supposed to level the playing field, was supposed to take a citywide race that needed much more funding, many more volunteers, a lot more of a ground game, and reduce it down to a size where it encouraged competition. And that, in fact, was the case. And you had Janet Borgens, who, is a dedicated community leader and someone that I know and count as a friend, unseated by Councilmember Espinoza Garnica. And when I think about Janet's race and also, James Coleman and Rich Garbarino, the sweat equity that comes with district elections, I think, was part of what made the difference in two longtime incumbents with a long history of community service, not being reelected in favor of younger, more progressive candidates who took that ability to leverage the sweat equity in that smaller district and be successful. I'll stop there.
Don, you touched on a lot of really, really interesting parts. Going from saying reckoning on social justice and racism, going through a pandemic, when we see the rollout of district elections in places like Menlo Park, Redwood City, South San Francisco. For me, district elections is a form of social and racial justice, because now we see more equitable results, right? Where we feel represented, the community of San Mateo County, different communities in San Mateo County feel represented with the election of people like James Coleman, re-election of Alicia Aguirre, Michael Smith, Councilmember Espinoza Garnica, Jeff G., right? Like we see the result, and at first glance, we can say district elections worked, right? Because we have majority minority districts that now have minority representation that did not before. And I think that's wonderful. Um, I want to ask you so many questions because you brought up so many topics, right? You're talking about Alicia, and I feel like we're going to see a new Alicia Aguirre because she's not beholden to a re-election, and we may see more progressive policy. That's just my assumption, and I think the recent vote on the ADUs, on those limitations, right,
Right.
and you know, putting that on the table, and pushing that back. I was really impressed to see that vote. Right? Was it 6-2? I think, or 5-2? Right?
5-2, yeah.
Where we saw, you know, the council, Redwood City, say, "Hey, we need more housing, and this is a way that we can do it." And we saw some council members actually make comments that were untrue about what ADUs mean and how they're used. And luckily we had people like Michael Smith and Alicia Aguirre, like, you know, present the facts that ADUs are important and necessary. And yeah, so I think you touched on a lot of wonderful things. Can you tell us a little bit more about this for our audience, right? About district elections and why those are important, and what are some of the positive results that communities can see from holding district elections?
Sure, I'm happy to. So, you know, we could talk for 2 hours on what the history of district elections is, but you know, there was a combination um, of state laws and lawsuits that resulted in this concept of no matter what size of your city, because a place like San Jose and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland, those larger cities have had district elections for a long time. And you know, the question was always, does a city the size of Menlo Park or Brisbane or Redwood City need district elections, or can you sort of, you know, trust that a mix of people will be elected to represent the diversity of geography, of age, of ethnicity, of socioeconomic standing? And I think in some places you could and did. And it's not like Redwood City's council was not diverse at the point in time in which they dealt with the issue of district elections. It was very diverse. You had a Latina, you had an African American, you had an Asian American, you had lots of women. But the question is, how do you codify this district level election so that you're not competing citywide, and literally someone who doesn't actually spend any money but has the time and the energy, that sweat equity that I call it, to put into a campaign could potentially be successful and get elected. And so I haven't actually looked to see what, you know, the candidates, what Janet Borgens or Lizette Espinoza Garnica raised, or Isabella Chu, or even James Coleman versus Rich Garbarino. But it's not, it takes that concept of going door to door and doing phone banks and brings it to a more manageable level. Now, what I will say though is running as a candidate and then be elected and governing as you know, the honorable council member from district, whatever it might be, are two different challenges. So it's one thing to be successful and get elected. Another thing is to then, you know, get sworn in and be successful. And it really comes down to, can you get enough votes amongst your colleagues to agree with your idea and have it be, you know, a majority approval? And what I think was most fascinating about the ADU vote, and you know, without getting into, you know, who had the right information or the data points, because that's a tricky conversation. I was very impressed with the voice that Councilmember Espinoza Garnica brought to that discussion, because the voice of someone to sit on that city council and talk about living in a household where everyone was an essential worker and everyone had to leave that house almost every day to go to work and leave with that fear of an infection and the fear of bringing that coronavirus infection home is a voice that that city council hasn't had, at least in the time that I've been watching it. And so for me, the power of district elections is not that Janet Borgens couldn't have advocated on behalf of that community, because she could and she did and she will continue to. But Lizette is living that every day in a Latino household where multi-generations are living under the same roof, often working in frontline and essential jobs, fearing that they're going to infect their family every day that they come home. And that was a powerful, powerful voice to hear as a part of that ADU discussion.
Absolutely. Don, I really appreciate everything. How what you just said is, it truly is great. I do also appreciate that because, for the longest time, I felt that that voice was missing on the council. I really did. And so with district elections, I felt that it was such a big, the whole process was so difficult, right? It was a very difficult process with some of us, being, there's some ugliness happening there. And so I kind of still feel that there's a sense of like having to push back on people that feel that the only reason some of us participate is because we want to elect people from our own nationality, which is, not necessarily the case, right? So.
Right. Well, look, nobody wants to give up power, right? And moving from a citywide election model to a district election model means that someone feels like they're going to have to give up power so that someone else can have power. That's an unfortunate way to look at it. And, Rudy, to your point about the pandemic, all of these discussions in Redwood City about moving to district elections, and then also the other companion to that was moving the election from an odd year to an even year, right? So the power of turnout when the governor's on the ballot or the president is on the ballot was the other very powerful factor. I mean, they're a companion here. So you had district elections, and then you had an 85% turnout in the presidential election in San Mateo County. Now, a little footnote that we probably won't have time to get to is that the turnout in Councilmember Espinoza Garnica's district was lower than the other districts in Redwood City. So you've still got some things to work on there in terms of voter participation and engagement, but we're probably not going to get to that. What the pandemic has really shown me is there was we'll call it a 2.5% unemployment rate in San Mateo County leading up to, February of 2020. And we had this amazing economy and it felt like everyone was employed. And how could you not look at that unemployment rate and think, well, whether they live in Atherton and North Fair Oaks, everyone must be doing great. Well, literally in a day, what this pandemic has shown us is that we have these very deep pockets in very specific zip codes and within them very specific census tracts where the same issues are compounding themselves in terms of great inequity. So in the same places where it was hard to get people to fill out the census because of a distrust of government, because of a fear that if I participate in something or I provide information on a form or to a website, I might come home to my spouse not being there, or my children might not see me again because ISIS come and picked me up. Whether it's healthcare, it's students of color who didn't have access to Wi-Fi, small business owners who didn't have access to computers or to Wi-Fi. I mean, we're seeing the same issues of inequity in the same places. And that's what's different post-pandemic, and why that voice for Lizette was so powerful for me that night in the ADU discussion is not every neighborhood in Redwood City maybe should have second-story ADUs or not have second-story ADUs, but something as important as a citywide policy needs to have the flexibility that if you do have a largely Latino or Tongan or Filipino neighborhood or whatever the demographic is, where you have multi-generations living in the same house, under the same roof, because they can't afford to live in separate places themselves, if that family can spread themselves out and be more comfortable and safer from a public health standpoint, then they need to be given the tools to do that.
Yeah,
Yes.
I absolutely agree, and I think that that's, you touched on some really important points there as to why these things are important, and we see, I would say, a positive domino effect, right, from the district elections, who got elected, and these very immediate results of impact on the Redwood City community specifically. And when I also think about like Project Home Key, right, in Jeff G's district, and some of the ruckus that it caused, but it was a very, 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 very quick and swift response to an ongoing issue, right? We have a housing emergency, and that's just putting out, a small fire of this giant forest fire that we have in terms of housing, that just like it's never ending. And I'm just happy that our county is actually prioritizing this and making swift decisions to address the housing emergency. If I recall correctly, Jeff G, when we had him on here, he said that there was a 10-year waiting list for that housing. And that's actually quite shocking, right? That even though we've had nearly 200 temporary housing units that were added by the purchase of one of those hotels in Redwood Shores, we still have a 10-year waiting list. So when people are in quick need of housing, especially our seniors or people that are very much at risk of losing their homes, we want to be able to give them a place to restart, a place to be with dignity before they take their next step, right? So I think it's important to remind folks that this temporary housing is a much better option than having people on the street. Not only because we have human beings that need to be under a roof and be safe, but also because it allows them to get back on their feet so that they don't end up on the street, right? So they can come back into society and be people that, if they're working individuals, can find a job, can take care of their family, and really make that next step, and keep them off the street. I think that some people don't realize that housing is super important. Otherwise, you're going to have people walking on the street, and then we have to worry about homelessness. We have to worry about fires that happen sometimes when they group up. I know Menlo Park had to deal with that this year. And we want to, we want to take care of our human beings. I mean, these are human beings.
Right.
We have to remember that. And a lot of times I feel like people dehumanize them when they talk about these folks, and they are people, and they deserve to have dignity. They deserve a shelter as a human right. And our county is doing that. So with that said, I want to switch over to talk about San Mateo County. We've been talking a lot about Redwood City. Let's talk about what happened across the county. And what do you think is going to happen in 2021 and 2022, right? Because I see people starting to kickstart their campaigns for 22. We have some important elections coming up, specifically in the Board of Supervisors, and what that could mean for the county as a whole. So what we saw in 2020, how can we see that translate into 2022? Because there was a lot of things that changed.
And
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Ruby, can I just add to that? It's going to be, I'm just going to add, like, what can we do as Latinos to increase our presence for, what can we do, to get ready? There's a lot of things decisions, whether it's housing, all this COVID, the business, getting businesses back. What can we do to prepare?
So where do we start with that? Well, we'll transition. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So let's transition out of the housing question into the countywide question. As a white person, I have a lot of conversations with people who struggle with this concept of inherent bias, right? Well, I'm not a racist. Well, inherent bias doesn't mean you are a racist. It means that you accept the fact that you have a set of conditions in your life which allow you to have a privilege on some level over someone who does not look like you. And some people get that and some people don't. And what I tell people is if you can't acknowledge and understand your inherent bias or the concept of privilege that comes with your skin color, then you do run the risk of becoming a racist. I find that there's also the same concept of inherent bias in the subject of housing. If now, after a global pandemic, with the issues of displacement, eviction, homelessness, if now moving forward, you are still someone who is opposed to housing or homeless housing or a navigation center across from, the water, or higher densities clustered around Caltrain stations and much more affordable housing, then you run the risk of being a racist vis-a-vis your opposition to housing for people at all income levels. And, I may upset some of the people that I know and interact with on a business level, but that's just the way I feel. Then we think about like, what can the Latino community do? What can the API community do? Unfortunately, I think we're going to have the same issues of distrust with government that came with the census or came with applying for grants and financial assistance because of the economic impacts of shelter in place, potentially with the vaccine. And I think Latino community leaders, API community leaders are going to have to work very hard in messaging, in being examples for their community that we have to trust San Mateo's public health infrastructure. And hopefully that will become a little bit easier under a Biden-Harris administration than it is in the last 20 days of what we have now in Washington. But unless the Latino community is in line for the vaccine and shows up for that second vaccine injection, if that's the particular vaccine that they get, the Latino community is going to continue to suffer potentially unnecessary ongoing economic impacts because of that distrust. So for me, the most important thing that Latino community leaders can do is be that example and be those messengers to say this is safe and we have to do this. We have to do this to get our kids back in the classroom. We have to do this to get ourselves back at work. We have to do this to keep, abuelita safe and, be able to be the family, that we know has been part of the struggle within the Latino community. Family it could be 50 people, right? And so if we're going to get back to that, then we all have to get vaccinated. One of the things that I've been so privileged to do is to work with the Board of Supervisors, the County Manager's Office, Roseanne Faust at SAMCETA, and I know you guys have spoken with her. She loves Peninsula 360, is to really work on small business support. And what we find in San Mateo County is our small businesses are owned by women, by immigrants, by veterans, LGBTQ, and they employ immigrants and women and people of color. And it's devastating. I think about Manuel, who is my example of pivoting with El Vimar and La Viga. I mean, this guy opened a restaurant in Palo Alto during the pandemic. There's no greater example of a small business owner. Or Donato has opened up little grocery stores within Donato's and Crew. And there are examples of that all up and down San Mateo County. But we have got to support our small businesses because not all of them will survive. Some of them have already closed. But we've got to think about how do we shop local. Before I go to buy something on Amazon, can I buy it in downtown Redwood City or on Mission Street in Daly City or in downtown San Mateo?
Wonderful. Well, that's great, Don. Thank you.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of things today, and we're just running out of time. We got a couple minutes left. Thank you, Don, for the insight that you've provided, for this great conversation. I think that the Latino community, I think we're ready to take those steps, right? At least us leaders in the community that really care to make sure that our small businesses are taken care of, so that people can come back to work, and also serving as an example by getting the vaccine ourselves, right? And letting people know that we're getting the vaccine. We also have to acknowledge, and I've read about this quite a bit. Historically, the government hasn't been friendly to Black and Brown communities when it comes to pharmaceuticals, vaccinations, etc. And I think it's important that people understand that, yes, mistakes were made in the past. Yes, we need to learn from them. And at this moment in time, we have a public health crisis that has become an economic crisis, that has become a housing crisis, that has become, so many other, brought to light so many other issues and disparities in our society. And really, that vaccine, no, it's not some like golden ticket, silver bullet, but it is a big step towards solving that. It is a big step towards solving that, right? So that people
you have to acknowledge the past. You have to acknowledge why that mistrust exists, and for very good reasons. And Rudy, really quick to answer your question, and Connie as well, as we look forward to the elections in 2022, I think any community has to also believe in the concept of an advocate or of a partner. So, as a gay man, I had to trust in allies who were fighting for my right to eventually marry my husband. And the Latino community has many allies across San Mateo County. And so you don't necessarily have to have an LGBTQ person in elected office for them to be an ally for you on behalf of your policies and what you need. And the same thing goes for any group in San Mateo County. I think we absolutely need younger, more diverse elected officials throughout the county, but that may take some election cycles. So as the Latino community thinks about, sort of who's up in 2022, the concept of your allies is as important as finding the right person to run to represent your community directly.
That's right.
Great.
Thank you, Don. We appreciate
Thank you.
Yeah.
We definitely have to have you back. We definitely want to continue this conversation because
anytime.
It was great. And
well, I feel like there's a lot. Yeah, sorry, there's a lot things that we could have still talked about, a lot of things that we still need to work on. You were right on about, voter registration and voter participation in certain areas, not just in Redwood City, but throughout San Mateo County, certain areas that still need, to increase that participation. So I feel like there's so much more that we need to be doing. There's so much more work that we need to do in our communities, right? But we really, really appreciate the time that you've given us today for being here. Really, really thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Don, enjoy Palm Springs.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you so much, and have a great 2021.
All right. See you next
Happy New
week.
Year.
Bye, Don. Connie, another awesome conversation. Otra conversación increíble, ¿no? Como
wow. Es que él tiene tanta experiencia, ¿verdad? Como estratega político, ¿verdad? Entonces, tiene mucha sabiduría, conoce muchas personas, ha trabajado en cuantas campañas y wow.
Sí, las cosas que me resaltaron era los temas de justicia social, las elecciones a nivel de distrito, ¿no? Cómo han cambiado en ciudades como Menlo Park, Redwood City, South San Francisco, esas comunidades, ¿no? Que ahora tenemos representación de personas que son parte de grupos de minorías, de la comunidad de minorías como latinos, asiáticos, ¿no? Los cambios que estamos viendo en Redwood City, con Alicia Aguirre, con Espinosa Gárnica, Michael Smith, Jeff Gino, todo esto. Y también hablando de que aunque en el pasado comunidades de color no han tenido la mejor experiencia con los gobiernos, ¿no? En cuanto a los farmacéuticos, el desarrollo de eso y las vacunas, pero que sí es súper importante que nosotros aceptemos y que confiemos en nuestros aliados, ¿no? Que esta vacuna es una vacuna necesaria para que nosotros podamos regresar o comencemos a regresar a la normalidad.
Sí, entonces nosotros, o sea, es la cosa de que nosotros tenemos que tener confianza en la ciencia, ¿verdad? En la ciencia y ponernos la vacuna y platicar con las personas para que ellos también tengan ese tipo de confianza en esa vacuna y que la comunidad realmente lo haga para poder salir de esto, pues juntos, ¿verdad? Todos tenemos que poner de nuestra parte. Pero sí me gustó mucho lo que dijo también al final acerca de los aliados, ¿verdad? Tenemos que trabajar como comunidad, con diferentes aliados de nuestra comunidad, trabajar juntos también con ellos, así, igual con políticamente, ¿verdad?
Sí, así
Sí.
que todos los que nos están viendo y escuchando, por favor, si no se han registrado para votar, háganlo. Si son ciudadanos, obviamente, regístrense para poder votar y participar en el proceso electoral de nuestra comunidad. Es súper importante, necesitamos su voto. Y también ver quiénes son nuestros aliados, ¿no? Y para elegir a esas personas que van a abogar por nosotros en esos consejos municipales, en la junta de directores, ¿no? Del condado, los supervisores del condado. Hay muchos puestos importantes que nos impactan el día al día.
Ahí es donde yo te digo, Rudy, que es bien importante que todavía tenemos mucho trabajo que hacer en eso de registrar a personas para votar, en hablar con ellos acerca de cómo funciona, ¿verdad? La ciudad, quién hace las decisiones del distrito escolar, de la ciudad, del condado. Entonces, yo pienso que todavía tenemos mucho, este año vamos a tener mucho trabajo para trabajar en nuestras comunidades y realmente para que participen, para que se informen, para prepararnos, ¿verdad? Como estaba
Sí,
diciendo, para prepararnos para las próximas elecciones.
así es. Bueno, Connie, feliz año nuevo, me encantó verte.
Igualmente,
Espero verte en persona pronto, ojalá, ¿no? En el estudio. Así que te mando un
sí,
gran abrazo.
igualmente, cuídate mucho.
Chao, Connie, que estés bien.
Adiós.